The sun doesn't set gently in Tucson. It drops behind the Santa Catalinas and leaves the desert cold and quiet within minutes. By the time investigators had cataloged every piece of physical evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home, they had something rare in a kidnapping case, a detailed forensic picture of what happened inside that house. What they didn't have was a face to attach to it. 7 weeks in, that remained the central problem. The glove lead had collapsed completely. DNA recovered from a pair of black gloves found near a roadside 2 miles away, gloves that visually resembled what the masked figure wore on doorbell footage had been run through the national database, cross-referenced against profiles from the scene, and ultimately traced to a restaurant worker in the neighborhood, someone with no connection to Nancy Guthrie whatsoever, a dead end dressed up as a breakthrough for 2 full weeks before it dissolved. What remained was the mixed DNA profile recovered from inside the house. Not Nancy's, not anyone in her family. An unknown male, somewhere in a sample that investigators had been reluctant to describe in detail. The Pima County Sheriff confirmed the profile existed, confirmed it was being analyzed, and confirmed that forensic genetic genealogy, the same methodology that identified the Gilgo Beach killer and connected Brian Koberger to 4 murders in Idaho, was now in play. The process, a former FBI supervisory agent told CBS News, takes a while. That's not vagueness. That's the reality of building a family tree from partial DNA, running it through genealogical databases, and narrowing thousands of possible relatives down to a single person. While that analysis continued, investigators were circling back through the neighborhood with a new set of questions. Residents near the Catalina foothills told News Nation that FBI agents had returned not to review old answers, but to ask about people who were no longer there. Former neighbors who had moved out in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. Construction workers who had been inside homes nearby. A former FBI agent who reviewed the approach said, "This kind of backward canvas signals forward momentum. You return to the same geography when new information cell records, purchase data, timeline reconstructions suddenly makes old answers mean something different." One detail investigators kept returning to was the security gate at the front of Nancy's house. Nearly impossible to force from outside, according to law enforcement sources who reviewed the property. That physical reality had pushed some experts toward a theory that required at least 2 people, one already inside before the masked figure appeared at the door, one waiting to help move Nancy out through the front. Sheriff Nanos had declined to confirm or deny the 2-person theory. He had also declined to say whether investigators believed they were looking for one suspect or several. He had said one thing, once, to NBC News, that investigators believed they understood why that specific house was targeted, and that the person or persons responsible might do this again. That last part had not received the attention it deserved. Not, might have done it before, might do it again, present tense, forward-looking. A sheriff who believed the threat was ongoing and was, for whatever reason, not sharing the reasoning behind that belief with the public. The ransom notes continued to complicate the picture. Multiple letters sent to news outlets in Tucson and nationally demanded cryptocurrency payment with deadlines that came and went. The FBI confirmed they were taking the correspondence seriously. A California man had already been charged with sending a fraudulent demand, someone attempting to profit from the case with no actual connection to it. But at least one note contained a specific detail about Nancy's Apple Watch, its location. The night she disappeared that had not been made public before the note was sent. That detail mattered. It narrowed the field of people who could have written it to someone with direct knowledge of that night. And then there was the question of the internet. A neighbor had told News Nation's Brian Enton that his Ring camera history showed no footage from the window when Nancy disappeared. Not corrupted footage, not partial footage. The history was simply not available. The FBI acknowledged they were looking into a possible connectivity disruption in the area that night. The masked figure in the doorbell footage had been carrying something in a jacket pocket that analysts had described as possibly consistent with a signal jamming device, though the FBI had stopped short of confirming that identification officially. If the disruption was deliberate, it meant the operation had a technical component. It meant someone had planned not just the physical approach, but the digital one, understood what cameras existed, what networks they ran on, and how to create a window of darkness inside a neighborhood that believed it was being watched. That was not a crime of desperation. That was architecture. And somewhere inside that architecture was a name that the FBI's genealogy lab was working toward. One strand of inherited DNA at a time. The case wasn't cold. It was just moving at the speed of science rather than the speed of news. Those two timelines had never aligned well. What investigators found next would depend on which thread pulled first. There's a moment in every kidnapping investigation when the physical evidence stops expanding and the analytical work takes over. The scene has been processed. The witnesses have been interviewed. The databases have been searched. What remains is pattern, the slow work of connecting behavior across time to a single actor. The Nancy Guthrie investigation had reached that moment. What the forensic record showed, assembled in full, was not a single night's crime. It was a campaign. The doorbell camera footage, released publicly by FBI Director Kash Patel on February 10th, had shown a masked figure at the front door on the morning Nancy disappeared. But investigators working the case had identified something the public release didn't make explicit. The images came from more than one date. In one photo, the figure carried a backpack and wore a holstered weapon near his waist. In another, both were absent. The Pima County Sheriff's Office, when pressed, said there were no timestamps on the images and called suggestions about multiple dates speculative. But sources briefed on the investigation had told both ABC News and Fox News independently that the suspect had been at that door before February 1st. A separate visit, a separate day. One theory investigators were working. On the earlier visit, the figure noticed the camera and left. Came back only after developing a plan to neutralize it, covering the lens with branches, attempting to block it with a gloved hand, and apparently carrying equipment capable of disrupting the network it transmitted on. The FBI had asked neighborhood residents to search their own camera systems back to January 1st, 1 month before the abduction. That request made no sense if investigators believed this began on February 1st. It made complete sense if they believed someone had been watching this house, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, its single occupant for weeks before acting. Now connect that to what the sheriff had said and not said. He believed the house was targeted. He understood the reason. He was not sharing it publicly. He also believed the perpetrator might strike again. What kind of targeting logic repeats? Not random theft, not a grudge rooted in personal history. What repeats is method, a system for identifying and approaching a specific profile of target. Isolated, elderly, financially connected, with a public family member whose wealth was known. The mixed DNA inside the house pointed towards someone who had been inside before the night of the abduction, or someone who entered during it, without forced entry at any point that matched a break-in. The security gate made exterior forced entry almost impossible, which meant either Nancy let someone in, someone she didn't recognize as a threat, or someone had been inside before she came home, before anyone was watching. The former neighbors who had left the area just before the disappearance. The construction workers nearby with access to the neighborhood's layout and daily patterns. The specificity of information in at least one ransom note. Each element pointed toward the same structural reality. This required inside knowledge, not necessarily someone Nancy knew personally, but someone who had gotten close enough to the edges of her world to map it. The FBI's return to the neighborhood wasn't a sign of stagnation. It was a sign that new data cell tower records, financial transactions, the slow progress of genealogy analysis had begun illuminating specific people in the background of a picture investigators had been staring at for 2 months. The gloves had traced to a dead end. The CODIS search had returned nothing. But forensic genetic genealogy doesn't require a criminal record. It requires relatives, people who submitted DNA to ancestry databases voluntarily without ever imagining their cousin, or their uncle, or their brother would one day become the reason a federal investigation knocked on their door. That knock was coming. The question was whether Nancy Guthrie would still be found in time for it to matter. One senior FBI official had confirmed to local media that the agency was cooperating with Mexican federal law enforcement, not because there was confirmed evidence Nancy had been moved across the border, but because Tucson is 45 miles from it, and in a case with no known location for the victim after 7 weeks. Standard protocol required that every corridor stayed open. The search had never stopped. It had simply gone quiet in the way that deep investigative work goes quiet, not because nothing was happening, but because the most important work was happening somewhere a camera couldn't follow. By the time the 7th week had passed, the public face of the investigation had gone still. No press conferences, no new releases from the FBI Phoenix field office. The last major update from law enforcement had been the confirmation that the glove DNA traced to someone entirely outside the case, but still meant working. It didn't mean closed. Savannah Guthrie had walked into the Today Show studio on March 5th, not to broadcast, just to see her colleagues. She had stood in a room filled with yellow flowers, the same color as those piling up outside her mother's home in Tucson, and she had told the people around her that she wanted to come back. Didn't know how not to. The family had committed $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, not waiting for resolution, not tying the gesture to an outcome. A recognition that the nightmare Nancy's family was living had other families inside it too. Less visible, less resourced, further from the cameras. The combined reward had climbed past $1.2 million. Tip lines at the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Office continued receiving calls. Fabian Pacheco, who oversaw one of the tip lines, had said approximately 10% of what came in carried actual investigative value. At 1,500 leads and rising, that was still a significant number of threads to pull. The genealogy process continued without a public timeline. The mixed DNA profile from inside the house, the unknown male, the one that didn't belong, was still being worked through laboratory analysis and family reconstruction. Every week it continued was another week the suspect had not been connected to a name. Every week also brought the profile closer to resolution. The Border Patrol coordination remained active. Mexican search teams, including the volunteer organization Madres Buscadoras de Sonora, had been informed and were looking. The proximity of the border to Tucson had kept that avenue open from the earliest days of the investigation. What remained unresolved? What would remain unresolved until law enforcement chose to address? It directly was the question Sheriff Nanos had answered, and not answered at the same time. The house was targeted for a reason. Investigators believed they knew the reason, and the person responsible, in the sheriff's own framing, might do this again. That last piece still hung in the air without an explanation attached to it. This case carries lessons that go beyond one family's nightmare. The first is mechanical and immediate. Nancy Guthrie's Nest doorbell camera detected motion at 2 in the morning. It recorded nothing because there was no active subscription. A device designed to document became a device that only confirmed a gap. For anyone relying on a smart home camera for security, that subscription isn't optional. It's the entire point. Without cloud storage, a motion alert is just a timestamp on a blank page. The second involves recognizing what investigators now call pre-operational surveillance. The masked figure didn't appear once and act. Evidence suggests multiple approaches over multiple days coming closer, observing, withdrawing, returning with a more complete plan. If a stranger appears at your door and leaves without speaking, that's worth noting. If it happens again, that's worth reporting. Law enforcement can't act on patterns they don't know exist. The third is what this case reveals about how targeted crimes are constructed in the digital era. Investigators aren't just looking for who committed the act. They're reconstructing weeks of planning what the suspect knew, how they learned it, who might have provided information without realizing its value. Former neighbors, contractors, people in the orbit of the household who weren't threats themselves but whose knowledge may have been borrowed. What this case teaches us about targeted abduction is that the crime scene and the crime origin are rarely the same location. The vulnerability was mapped long before the act. Security exists in layers, cameras, networks, relationships, community awareness, and a sophisticated actor looks for the gap between them. The Nancy Guthrie investigation has become an example studied by law enforcement professionals precisely because it shows how much can be prepared and how much can go unnoticed in a neighborhood that believed it was safe. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in Tucson for more than 50 years. She walked into her house on a Saturday night and has not been seen since. The investigation is active. The DNA analysis continues. The FBI's genealogy work doesn't require a confession. It requires patience and a match. Somewhere in a database, in a family tree, in a cell tower record or a retail transaction, there is a thread that connects to the man in the ski mask. The question that carries into whatever comes next is the one the sheriff has never answered directly. Why that house? That answer, when it comes, will change how we understand everything that preceded it. If you have information, the FBI tip line is 1800CALLFBI. The Pima County Sheriff's tip line is 520-351-4900. The combined reward exceeds $1.2 million. Subscribe to Cold Case Files USA. When this case breaks, that's where you'll find it first. The glove lead died quietly. No announcement, No press conference, just a sheriff's department statement confirming that DNA recovered from a pair of black gloves found near a roadside brush had been traced, through extended analysis, to a local restaurant worker with no connection to the case whatsoever. A lead that had consumed 2 weeks of investigative energy and generated hundreds of media reports had resolved into nothing. The man whose genetic material ended up on those gloves likely never heard Nancy Guthrie's name before the FBI knocked on his door. That erasure left investigators with a narrower but more consequential set of physical evidence. The mixed DNA profile recovered from inside the house remained active. Unknown male. No match in any database search so far. The sheriff confirmed publicly that the sample was being submitted for forensic genetic genealogy, a methodology that bypasses criminal records entirely and works instead through family connections, tracing inherited markers across genealogical databases until a biological relative surfaces. It has broken cases that went cold for decades. It also takes months. Former FBI supervisory agent Lance Leasing told CBS News plainly that the extended timeline was working against the investigation's momentum. Not against its resolution, against its momentum. The difference matters. Tips slow down. Media attention migrates. The public's sense of urgency softens. Investigators keep working, but the ecosystem that generates new leads begins to contract around them. 7 weeks in, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos was facing pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. A congressional candidate in Arizona had initiated a formal recall process, citing inconsistent public communications and what critics described as a failure to manage the investigation's public-facing timeline. Residents in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood had now been visited by agents 5, 6, 7 times. One longtime resident told Fox News she had spoken with FBI and sheriff's personnel together on a later visit and that investigators had specifically mentioned January 11th during that conversation, not February 1st, 3 weeks earlier. Nanos had pushed back on the framing that the surveillance photos showed multiple dates. His office released a statement saying there was no date or time stamp on the images, and that any conclusion about when they were taken was speculative. The FBI Phoenix office declined to comment. That contradiction, federal sources telling national outlets one thing, the county sheriff's office saying another, was not a small procedural disagreement. It was a fracture in the public record of one of the most scrutinized missing persons cases in recent American history. And it pointed towards something investigators were still not ready to state openly. The timeline of this crime did not begin on the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The FBI's request that neighbors check their home systems back to the 1st of January had never been adequately explained to the public. That was 31 days before the abduction. No law enforcement agency canvasses a month of footage based on a crime that happened in a single night. They canvass that far back when they believe the preparation extended that far when they're looking for a vehicle that passed the same corner on 3 separate occasions, or a figure that appeared near a property and left, or a pattern of behavior that only becomes visible when you lay the days end to end. The security gate at the front of Nancy's home continued to occupy investigators' attention. The structure was built to resist exterior force, almost impossible to breach from outside without tools and time. Some law enforcement analysts who had reviewed the layout told News Nation that the physical constraints of the entry point supported a theory involving more than one person. One possibility, the masked figure at the doorbell camera was not working alone. Someone else had already cleared the gate. The role of the exterior figure was coordination, not entry. Sheriff Nanos had not ruled out a single actor. He had also not confirmed one. What he had confirmed, in a conversation with NBC News, was that investigators believed they understood the reason this specific address had been chosen, and that whoever was responsible represented a potential ongoing threat. The word ongoing had not been walked back. It had not been clarified. It sat in the public record, attached to a case with no identified suspect, and pointed towards something the investigation had not yet been willing to say out loud. What connected a month of possible reconnaissance, a fortified entry point, an unknown DNA profile, and a sheriff warning about future risk? A theory of the crime that was larger than one night. A theory that required prior knowledge, deliberate preparation, and access to information about a household that no stranger standing at the curb would have possessed. That was the question building beneath every public statement, every released image, every tip line announcement. Not who was the man in the mask, but who told him where to look, There is a particular kind of silence in an investigation when the physical phase ends and the analytical phase takes over. Press conferences stop. Statements become shorter. The agency goes quiet not because the work is stopped, but because the work has moved somewhere. Language can't easily follow into laboratory results, into data cross-references, into the slow triangulation of a person's existence from partial biological material. The Nancy Guthrie investigation had entered that silence, but inside it, a picture had been assembling. Not a complete one, not one that could be presented in court, but a structural one, a shape that explained why the evidence looked the way it did, and why the investigators kept returning to the same geography with new questions. Consider what had been confirmed, placed in sequence without editorial interpretation. A woman living alone in an affluent, secluded neighborhood. A daughter with a nationally recognized face and a publicly known career. A home in a location that required knowing the address not visible from a main road, not the kind of property a stranger encounters by accident. An entry point engineered to resist forced access. A doorbell camera that had been studied and then deliberately neutralized. A Nest system that detected intrusion and recorded nothing. A neighbor's camera system with a gap precisely aligned to the window of the crime. And a perpetrator whose DNA appeared inside the house before any of this became public knowledge. Each of those facts had been reported individually. Placed together, they described a single coherent operation. Not opportunistic, not reactive. An operation that required someone to know that Nancy lived there alone, know her schedule, know the camera positions, know the subscription status of the doorbell system, know the gate. The FBI's return to the neighborhood to ask about former residents and construction workers was not random. It was the investigative equivalent of asking, who had legitimate access to this address before the crime? Who could have walked through that front gate without raising suspicion, noted the layout, observed the routines, and carried that information somewhere it could be used? That line of inquiry pointed not toward a stranger with a grudge, but toward a network of proximity, someone in the loose orbit of the household who hadn't triggered alarm because their presence had a plausible explanation. A contractor, a neighbor, a service worker, someone whose knowledge of the property was incidental to their presence and invisible until it wasn't. Sheriff Nanos had confirmed that investigators believed the house was targeted for a specific reason. He had declined to name the reason. That omission was not accidental. In active kidnapping investigations, law enforcement withholds information that could compromise the integrity of ongoing leads, specifically, information that would tell a suspect what investigators know and allow them to adjust accordingly. The fact that Nanos would not state the reason publicly suggested that the reason, once known, would identify someone, or, at minimum, narrow the field sharply enough that the wrong person's awareness of it would cause damage. That was the answer to what Peak 1 left open. The question wasn't whether the masked figure had been to the house before. The evidence strongly suggested he had. The deeper question was how he knew enough to come back prepared. And the answer to that was not in the mask, or the backpack, or the gloves. It was in the information that preceded all of it. Somewhere in the weeks before February 1st, knowledge about Nancy Guthrie's home, its layout, its camera system, its single elderly occupant had traveled from someone who possessed it legitimately to someone who used it to plan a crime. That transfer was what investigators were now chasing. The genealogy work, the construction worker names, the former neighbors, the January canvas. These were all different angles on the same question. Who was the bridge between the household and the perpetrator? The DNA from inside the house would eventually resolve to a name. When it did, that name would answer two questions simultaneously. Who was present during the crime, and who had access to the information that made it possible? Those might be the same person. They might not be. But the answer to the second question was the one that mattered most, because it was the answer the sheriff had in mind when he said this might happen again. Not that the same man would return, that the same method would be applied somewhere else. By the 7th week, the active evidence threads had narrowed to 2. The genealogy analysis of the mixed DNA profile and the neighborhood inquiry into people who had moved through the property's orbit before the crime. Both were progressing. Neither had produced a publicly confirmable result. The family had not stopped. Savannah Guthrie visited the Today Show studio in early March, not to broadcast, but to stand in the building that had been her professional home for years, and tell the people there that she intended to return. She had said she didn't know how to come back, and didn't know how not to. Her family had contributed $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, not contingent on outcome, not tied to resolution, offered in recognition that the system that was searching for Nancy was the same system trying to find thousands of other people whose families had fewer resources and less visibility. The combined financial incentive for information now exceeded $1.2 million, drawn from the FBI, a county-level reward organization, private donors, and the Guthrie family directly. More than 1,500 tips had been evaluated. Roughly 10% carried investigative value, according to the county official overseeing one of the tip lines. Authorities on both sides of the southern border had been briefed. The proximity of Tucson to Mexico had kept that corridor open as a matter of protocol, without any confirmed evidence that Nancy had been moved across it. The Madres Buscadoras de Sonora, a volunteer search organization in Mexico with experience recovering missing persons, had been notified and was engaged. What remained unanswered and what would remain unanswered until investigators chose to address it directly or until an arrest forced the information into public record was the specific reason the sheriff believed the house was chosen. That answer, when it surfaces, will reframe every piece of evidence that came before it. It will explain the preparation. It will explain the access. It may explain the silence that followed and the ransom notes that seemed designed more to create noise than to accomplish a transaction. The investigation was not cold. It was submerged, moving in directions that didn't make headlines because the work happening there was too granular for a press conference and too consequential for speculation. Nancy Guthrie had been gone for 50 days. Her phone, her wallet, and her medication were still on a table inside her house in the Catalina foothills. And somewhere, a laboratory was reading her abductor's family history, one genetic marker at a time. Two things are worth taking from this case. One practical, one structural. The practical one is about the camera that didn't record. Nancy's doorbell system detected motion at 2 in the morning. It logged a timestamp. It captured nothing usable because the account had no active storage subscription. That gap, $6 a month, maybe less, may have been the difference between a clear image of an unmasked suspect and weeks of forensic reconstruction from partial evidence. If you have a connected camera on your property, the recording function is not a premium feature. It is the feature. Without it, the device is a sensor with no memory. The second lesson is about how targeted crimes are built before they happen. This case shows that the planning phase is where vulnerability is assessed and access is mapped. The perpetrator, based on available evidence, had knowledge of the camera positions, the gate mechanics, the occupant's schedule, and the network infrastructure of the property. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. It didn't require a hack or a data breach. It required proximity and observation, the kind that passes unnoticed when it has a plausible cover. What this case teaches us about targeted abduction is that the crime scene is almost never where the crime began. The decision to act happens elsewhere in a conversation, in a walkthrough, in a transaction between someone with access and someone with intent. Community safety, in cases like this one, depends less on individual hardening of single households and more on the network of awareness that surrounds them. Investigators keep returning to this neighborhood because the answer they need is probably still there, in someone's memory of a face or a vehicle or a conversation that didn't seem significant until now. Nancy Guthrie was taken from a house in the Catalina foothills on a night when every layer of documentation failed simultaneously. The cameras didn't record. The neighbor's system went dark. The pacemaker disconnected. And an 84-year-old woman who could not walk 50 yards on her own vanished into a desert that has not yet given her back. The genealogy work is continuing. The neighborhood inquiry is active. And one question still has no public answer: the reason Sheriff Nanos believes that specific address was chosen, and what that reason implies about the risk that remains. If you have seen anything in the Tucson area that connects to this case, the FBI tip line is 1800-CALLFBI. The Pima County Sheriff's line is 520-351-4900. The reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery exceeds $1.2 million. Subscribe to Cold Case Files USA and turn on notifications. The moment this investigation breaks the arrest, the answer to why that house, the detail the sheriff has been holding back this channel, will be the first place it's covered in full.